Okay, and welcome back. We are continuing with our World War II unit. Like I mentioned last week was all about the Pacific. Today, we're turning our attention back to Europe, specifically to what Germany is doing during World War II. We're actually going to take a break from like looking at the fighting and the battlefields and all that sort of stuff, and look instead at another important thing that took place in World War II called the Holocaust, something that a lot of you guys seem to know stuff about from previous classes. I'm not sure if you covered that in English classes or history classes in middle school, but a lot of you have come in with a lot of prior knowledge about that. So let's go ahead and use that. We'll go ahead and I'll try to make references to whatever you may already know about as we start looking at this event called the Holocaust. Just for context, again, a little bit of review. Last week, we spoke about Japan's process of expansion in the Pacific Ocean. We saw how World War II started in the Pacific. We saw how the United States is drawn into World War II when it's attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. The United States declares war on what we call the Axis powers. That's just to say Germany, Japan, and Italy, right? The Nazis, Japan, and fascist Italy were all allies in World War II fighting against the United States and Britain. And we're going to see in the next class the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. But that's for the future. That's not review. That's coming up next week. And then three, we saw how the U.S. and its allies went on the offensive in the Pacific, meaning instead of playing defense, instead of getting attacked and stopping those attacks, we saw how the U.S. and its allies started doing the attacking. They started doing the conquering. They started doing the invading by island hopping, taking over island by island by island. And we saw how brutal the fighting was for each individual island. Now, as I mentioned, today we are shifting our focus back to Europe. Specifically, we are going to be looking at the Holocaust. By the end of today's lesson, we're going to be talking, or you should be able to explain, the process by which the Jews in Germany were targeted as what we call scapegoats for Germany's problems. To scapegoat means to blame everything on an individual person or a group of people. So we're going to see how the Jews were basically blamed for a lot of Germany's problems, and explain how the rights of Jews were eroded. That means slowly worn away, and how Jewish communities were isolated. Now, in this lesson, we're not going to be talking about the concentration camps. We're not going to be talking about the gas chambers. We're not talking about that yet. We will get to it, but there are some very important lessons for us today, for all of history, to understand how the Holocaust begins. So let's get started. So the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, in Germany, believed that Germans were part of a, quote, master race of people called Aryans. They believed that this master race looked like this guy over here, right? Like strong, muscular, blonde, blue eyes, chiseled chin. The reality, of course, you look at Hitler, he's none of these things, right? Not blonde, brown hair, not blue-eyed. He has brown eyes. So we know this is, I mean, the Nazis knew this wasn't 100% true, right? Like they know that to an extent they are, this is just a convenient philosophy for them. This is them just using this so that this guy can get power. They believed, furthermore, that these, quote, Aryans were superior. They were better than everyone else. They believed that all non-Aryans, especially the Jews, were inferior. Something that's very important to know is that Hitler isn't introducing anti-Semitism. Again, that means hatred of the Jews. The Nazis are not introducing anti-Semitism to Germany. There is a very long history of anti-Semitic prejudice, anti-Semitic hate in Europe. That goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. It goes all the way back to the early modern period. European leaders, European kings liked to blame the Jews for a lot of the problems that they were experiencing in their kingdoms because they were an easy target. They were big enough to be noticeable, but they were small enough where if you were to pick on them, there was very little they could do. They were basically a minority group that were being blamed. It was easy to blame them for being outsiders. So that's kind of what Hitler is taking advantage of. He knows that there's that hatred there. He knows that Germans are a part of this long tradition. So he's just taking advantage of that. So Hitler, as I mentioned, is using this hate to gather support for himself and for the Nazi party. After World War I, you have to remember, Germany was in a very bad place. They lost the World War, and they were experiencing a number of economic problems after World War I. This is a cartoon right here. It's an exaggeration. It's definitely what we would call today a racist or prejudiced drawing of a Jewish person. And you see how they're stabbing this soldier, this German soldier, technically, yes, sorry, excuse me, this German soldier in the back. That is what Hitler was arguing. That's what the Nazis were saying the Jews were doing to Germany. Was this true? Absolutely not. There were German soldiers who were Jewish in World War I. Some of Germany's most brilliant thinkers or most brilliant scientists were Jewish Germans. Again, does it matter that what I'm saying is true? Not to the Nazis. Remember that the Nazis ignored the truth. They ignore this sort of stuff because they are only trying to use or stoke this hatred so that people will believe them and give them power and authority. So just keep it, always keep that in mind. If you ever see anyone like using hatred or trying to blame things on another group or trying to, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like it's usually because they are trying to put themselves or someone else in power. It really just comes down to power. And speaking of power, once the Nazis are in control of Germany, they pass a series of laws called the Nuremberg Laws. Now, this is in 1935. This is about 4 years before the start of World War II. The Holocaust hasn't even technically started. But one of the important things to remember is that the Holocaust is not something that happened suddenly. It's not like one day a bunch of Germans woke up and decided to kill the Jewish people. What you actually see, the reality is just a slow erosion. It's gradual. And to make it worse, a lot of people saw these things happening and did nothing. So what are these Nuremberg laws? How do these represent a move towards the Holocaust? Well, the Nuremberg laws stripped the Jews of their citizenship. Like I said, even if there were Jews who fought for Germany in World War I, even if they were very good Germans, even if they were patriotic Germans, their rights were taken away. So the Jews are being taken their citizenship away. To make things even worse, the Nuremberg laws made it illegal for a Jew to marry a German. And it limited the types of work that Jews could do. Additionally, and this goes outside of the Jews, this goes back to this bigger idea that the Nazis want to create this, quote, master race. Anyone who wanted to get married had to get a certificate of fitness to have children. They basically had to be inspected by a Nazi doctor who would say, yeah, you don't have bad genes, you're not carrying like a disease, a genetic disease, sorry, or something that we consider undesirable. And you think about like, who are these guys to decide who gets to have babies or not, right? Like that's the level of control. That is the level of hatred that the Nazis are introducing with the Nuremberg laws. I mentioned this is applying to the Jews, but the law was also later extended, later in 1935, to anyone who was, quote, racially suspect, basically anyone that the Nazis also hated. This included the Roma, you may know them as gypsies, and people of African descent. So let's do our first check for understanding. We're about 10 minutes in. 3 true and false statements. 1, anti-Semitism existed in Europe, including Germany, long before Hitler and the Nazis arrived. Is that true or false? Number 2, the Nazis believed that they were part of a, quote, master race called the Aryans, who were better than all other people. And three, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their rights and forbade intermarriages between Germans and Jews. All right, so let's move on to Kristallnacht and isolation. Second part. Uh, Kristallnacht. A bit of a story here. So in November of 1938, there's a 17-year-old named Herschel Grinspan. And he looks like he'd totally be a student at Smith Tech. He is very close to your age. And in November, he's a German. He's a German Jew. He leaves to go visit his uncle in Paris, France. While he is in Paris, he receives a letter from Germany informing him that his father, who had lived in Germany for 27 years, had been deported back to Poland because he was Jewish. As revenge, Grinspan shot a German diplomat in Paris. So because he was upset that his dad was deported, his dad who had lived in Germany for 27 years was deported back to Poland, Grinspan shot a German diplomat, a German politician. The Nazis used this as an excuse to launch a violent attack on Jewish communities on the night of November 9th, 1938. Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, anything that represented the Jewish community was attacked, burned. We see a lot of shops here with the broken glass. That is actually where the name Kristallnacht comes from. It was the night of broken glass. And close to 100 Jews were murdered. Now, this is bad. This is terrible. What did the rest of the world do? Nothing. Much of the world remained silent. A lot of Jews in Germany realized, though, that things were only going to get worse for them in Nazi Germany. As a result, many tried to flee to other countries. People who migrate because they are seeking refuge or safety are called refugees. So these are Jewish refugees. So whenever you are hearing anything in the news about refugees, what they are talking about is people who are not bad people. They're not the people committing the violence. They're not the people doing these crimes. They're the people trying to get away from the crimes. They are the people trying to get away from the violence and seeking refuge. Now, knowing that these Jews were trying to escape for their own safety, countries like the US, Britain, and France initially, at first, accepted tens of thousands of refugees, but ultimately closed their doors to Jewish refugees. This is a really good example here of one of these refugee ships. And the story here is a very powerful one because it really shows us how a lot of countries, multiple countries actually, failed to act to save the about 300 people on board of this ship. So just let me very briefly describe or tell you about what's happening on this ship. This ship, is, as I mentioned, is carrying about 300 Jewish refugees who are leaving Germany. They initially sailed to Cuba because they thought Cuba would accept these Jewish refugees. Cuba actually denied them the ability to land. So they couldn't even land, they couldn't even port. And eventually the Cubans even were just outright hostile to this ship. They didn't want these Jews in Cuba, and they only accepted about 27 of them. So the rest of the people on the ship sailed to Miami in Florida in the United States, where their plea to enter the United States as refugees were also rejected by immigration authorities. Some members of the ship even tried contacting the president of the United States, FDR, Roosevelt, but they were ignored. The US was unwilling to open its doors to these Jewish refugees. Basically, they were told that there was a quota system. Those of you who are familiar with the immigration system may know that each country has what we call a quota, meaning only a certain number of people from that country can enter or immigrate for this or that year. Now, for Germany, that number was 27,000 people from Germany and Austria. The State Department, which back then controlled immigration, messaged the passengers and said that they had to wait their turns in line. They had to wait on the waiting list to qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they would be admissible into the United States. So the ship was turned back. They try landing in Canada. It's the same story. And eventually, because no one will take these, it's now down to about 270 Jews, the ship has to go back to Germany. What happened to most of these people on the ship? 240 of the people on this ship died in the concentration camps. So this was basically a death sentence for these people, these refugees seeking refuge, seeking safety. And it's one of these stories that is extremely important to retell, because this is not the first time, nor will it be the last time that refugees come to seek help from other countries. So then what happens? So Hitler was actually in favor of what we call emigration. Emigration is the opposite of immigration. It's when you leave a country. So these Jews are being encouraged by the Nazis to leave, right? It would be very convenient for Hitler and the Nazis to just have the Jews leave, right? However, because all the other countries, or so many other countries of the world, turned their backs on the Jews, they had to go back to Germany. Hitler, in an effort to control the Jews even more, orders all the Jews in the countries that he controlled to move into certain cities. In these cities, Jews were confined into certain neighborhoods called ghettos, or segregated Jewish neighborhoods. I'm sure you've heard of the word ghetto. That is where this comes from. A ghetto is a segregated Jewish neighborhood. It is where these people who the Nazis didn't want, or back in the Middle Ages, who these kings and queens of Europe didn't want, were segregated into these neighborhoods. Ghettos during this time were either walled off, like they literally built a wall around them, or they were surrounded by barbed wire to isolate them from the rest of the city. The Nazis had hoped that the Jews would starve to death or die of disease. And while that certainly happened in some cases, I think what the Nazis did not expect is for the Jewish resistance. In the next class, we are even going to see probably the most important one, called the Warsaw Uprising, where a number of Jews revolted. They had had enough and decided to take the fight to the Nazis. Hitler grew impatient with this and began to push and meet with his Nazi leadership to plan for a final solution, which is what we will be looking at in more detail in Friday's class. So to wrap up, let's do our last check for understanding. Again, 2 true and false questions. Number 4, countries like the United States, Britain, and France did all they could to accept many Jewish refugees. And 5, segregated Jewish neighborhoods were called ghettos. All right. Like I mentioned, this is part 1 of 2 lessons on the Holocaust. We, just like all our past classes, we finished with the video lecture. There is now a chapter reading along with the exit ticket at the end. If you have any questions or are curious and want to know more, or need something explained in a different way, please feel free to come to office hours, Tuesdays and Fridays, at 3:15 to 4, or on Wednesdays at 2 to 2:45. Or, of course, you can always email me at amaduena@alaalliance.org. And I look forward to seeing some of you at office hours. But until then, please stay safe, stay healthy. And I look forward to seeing some of your exit ticket responses later. Thank you.